We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast.
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome, everyone. We are going to start off today with a very timely topic, the topic of Iran. I have with me Dr. Ray Takeyh. I said that right, correct?
That's right.
Dr. Ray Takeyh. He is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializes in Iran. He is Iranian and specializes in political reform in the Middle East and Islamist movements and parties. Before joining the Council on Foreign Relations, you were a senior advisor on Iran at the State Department and a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. You've authored 3 books. You've written more than 250 opinion pieces and articles for many news outlets, and you've testified before Congress more than 20 times. So you know what you're talking about. And this is quite the week to have you for listeners. Because these podcasts aren't released as we record them. President Trump struck Soleimani just a few days ago. The Iranians responded, and we've been debating this all week. And I think we'll continue to debate it for some days to come. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being on the show.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, before we get into some detailed questions, and we have many, just your initial reactions to this entire week.
I think altogether, I would have to say it's been a positive week for the United States. The elimination of General Soleimani was a much-delayed proposition. It should have happened before. And I think it took considerable amount of courage for the president to do it. The operation seemed to have been flawlessly planned and executed quite perfectly. And I think everybody for a long time assumed that if the United States engaged in such an activity, the reprisals would be quite significant. What we saw is an Iranian reprisal that seemed to be more symbolic than real. So I think we have restored our deterrent power, eliminated a terrorist, a mass murderer, and we have demonstrated that despite what many say, the Iranians aren't 10 feet tall. So altogether, I think it's been a very good week for President, for the United States, for people of Iraq, Iran, globally.
Yeah, I agree. And it's been perplexing to me to see this debate play out. I understand the political motivations behind many of the Democrats' comments, but I would expect them to stay silent more than anything else. Like, fine, don't give the president credit, but the position they've taken is pretty indefensible.
Well, it's a curious position because
That's a nice way to put it.
After the Iranian attack against the Saudi oil installation, many people across the political spectrum said that president was wrong not to respond. Many Democrats said that. Yeah. When he responded, they said he was wrong to respond. Right. So it's a position where he can't.
He can't do right.
I suspect, and this Ben and I, our politics are so polarized that we can't come together on Soleimani.
That's extremely concerning. You said something, which is that Soleimani should have been taken out much earlier. Yes. And were there any actual opportunities to do that because you look at this particular attack, we have very good intelligence, and I know not everybody can see that intelligence, but it is very good intelligence that he was about to commit attack. Plus, I'm going to just say this as an aside, the president's taking a lot of criticism for implying that Soleimani was going to attack an embassy. And people are saying, well, how do you know? And I say, well, he just did attack an embassy, right? Like, it just happened.
Well, that's his job. Right. That's the resume. Yeah. That's his business card. He attacks American installations.
And so this situation to me seemed extremely defensible for all those reasons. But can you identify any other situations in previous history where we might have taken him out and been actually as well off as we are right now?
My understanding is on 2 occasions during the Bush administration, an opportunity presented itself. I don't know if it even got past CENTCOM. I don't know if he even got to the White House, but I think the military leadership at that time decided not to. And you have to recall, that was the time if the time frame is correct, during the height of the Iraqi civil war.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of concern regarding the fragility of the Iraqi government.
Right. You're preoccupied. You're really going to start a fight with another country. Yeah.
So the military, for a variety of reasons, I don't know exactly the reasons, but they chose not to. I don't know how far that got up to the chain of command, because it wouldn't even get past CENTCOM.
What about, didn't we talk Israel down at one point from striking Soleimani?
I don't know that episode. I think Israelis are always a little more cautious about this than people think. Although I think they would strike Soleimani if they had a chance. Once Soleimani came to the periphery of Israel, trying to establish fortifications on Israeli periphery in Syria, then Israelis struck back very hard against the Iranian fortifications and missile bases and factories and so on. So they have demonstrated they're willing to defend their interests.
Yeah.
I suspect if Israelis really thought it was in their interest, they might have done it, but I don't know the specifics of that episode.
Yeah. Any time during the Obama administration that there was really an opportunity?
Not that I know of.
Yeah. And, the question is, would they have even taken that opportunity, especially considering their main goal was the Iran nuclear deal? Yeah,
I suspect they would not have. Also, because if you kind of listen to the commentary, many of them believe this would be a prelude to war. And President Obama was very concerned about getting into a war and getting into any sort of a military confrontation in the Middle East. So I suspect he would be more reticent about it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that philosophy for a second, because that is the driving narrative of many Democrats. If you do anything, it means war. And I'm like, I think that's an overly simplistic way of looking at things. But there's something else that concerns me about that narrative, which is this. And Susan Rice has come out and said that, because of President Trump's actions, we've seen an uptick or a beginning of Shia proxies lobbing rockets on U.S. bases. That wasn't happening before. And my first thought is, okay, so are you saying that our strategic actions are actually decided upon by these homemade rockets? Like, is that how a superpower is supposed to act? Because that is the implication of that narrative.
Well, again, the Democratic narrative on this is curious because Susan Rice and many others also say what the president has done in this case could get us evicted from Iraq. Yeah. This is kind of ironic.
Yeah, it is. Like, where do they stand? Yeah.
Given the fact that in 2011, it was the Obama administration that evicted itself from Iraq.
Yeah.
So they have to decide whether they want to stay or leave in Iraq. Yeah. But, the president doesn't get a lot of credit. I just think if the president came out for milk, they would oppose it. It's just the way the politics of this are working out. As far as the Shia militias being more activated against the United States, I suspect this will lessen that. Yeah. Because for a long time, for 40 years, predating the Iran deal and all that, the Islamic Republic had a doctrine, a terrorism doctrine, that worked very well. Namely, they would employ terrorism against the United States and others. But so long as that terrorism was done by surrogate and proxies, then they would shield themselves from retaliation.
Yeah.
Even when it was obvious who was behind it. Everybody knows who was behind the 1983 bombing of the Marine barrack in Lebanon. Everybody knew that.
Yeah.
It was executed by Hezbollah. I know for a fact that Clinton administration knew who was behind the 1996 bombing of the Khor Towers residence in Saudi Arabia.
Really?
There was intercepts.
Yeah.
And everybody knows who was behind the carnage in Iraq against the American forces. But so long it was done by surrogates, Iranians were thought to be immunized. What is not stated here is that the president actually nullified that doctrine.
Yeah.
What he said is, if there is terrorism against, in this case, American installations, even by the Iranian proxies, the address is Tehran.
Yeah.
That's a huge break from 40-year bipartisan pattern of conceding to Iranian terrorism if there's some ambiguity about its source, even though there isn't any.
Yeah.
Now, how that message is received in Iran remains to be seen, but I suspect that will have a tempering effect. Now, what happens, the president is always consistent, so what happens next remains to be seen. But I think that in of itself is something that people have not sufficiently paid attention to, because it's a disruption of a 40-year bipartisan pattern, I have to say.
Yeah, we've been allowing this plausible deniability. for a very long time.
I call it implausible deniability.
That's a better way to put it.
Because everybody knew who did it.
Yeah.
Everybody knew who ordered it.
Yeah.
But we wanted not to have the altercation, so we bought into the fiction that Iranians offered us. Namely, it was Hezbollah, it was Saudi Hezbollah, or what have you.
Right. Yeah, they wanted to. I mean, they're very good at surrogate warfare. Just coming from the special operations community myself, we specialize in surrogate warfare. We call it unconventional warfare, but it's basically you train.
Yeah, but you know who's behind it.
Yeah, well, not if you're doing your job correctly, but we know it's Iranians, right? And but they've always been good at this. They do it throughout the region, and
because it's something that's worked for them.
Yeah.
They have inflicted cost without corresponding punishment.
Right. And that continued. And so the next question that rises to the top in this week's debates are, the main one is, are we safer? Okay. And so as I watch the Democrats' rhetoric, and it tends to shift quite a bit here and there, they've sort of moved away from whether the president was authorized or not, because that question has been answered, I think, very clearly. They've moved into a more strategic question of, are we safer? And why did we leave the doctrine of appeasement via the JCPOA, which is just for everybody, that stands for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is also known as the Iran nuclear deal. So we left that, which basically was a payoff, right? A payoff to say, hey, please delay your enrichment of uranium for us for at least 10 to 15 years.
It didn't delay enrichment. Enrichment continued under the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, they're limited at like 3.67%. But we have very little. Well, let's talk about that. Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, the JCPOA, the Iran deal, did not proscribe Iranian enrichment. Iranian enrichment continued. What is said that Iranian enrichment has to be capped at 3.67, which is not a big deal. Yeah, because you can enrich.
You can't make a nuclear weapon out of 3.67%, but you can do energy. Yeah.
But if you can't perfect enrichment at 3.67, it doesn't take you that long to get to weapon grade.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to ship out the enriched uranium that they maintained as a result of that, and they have renounced all their obligations. The Iran nuclear deal was not a sturdy barrier to Iranian proliferation.
Right.
It allowed the modernization of the Iranian nuclear program because it did nothing to stop the R&D.
Yeah.
And that was a real big deal for them because they actually wanted to modernize their program and not continue enrichment with primitive technologies.
Right.
So they were going to phase out some of those centrifuges, which they dismantled as part of the Iran deal anyway.
Yeah.
What they traded in was some capacity for the ability to modernize their program and get sanctions relief.
Yep.
That was a pretty good deal for them.
It was a great deal for them, actually. But also, we couldn't even access some of their military facilities either, where they could easily be doing even more advanced enrichment.
It is a violation of not just the Iran nuclear deal, but their basic safeguard obligations on the NPT when they prevent access.
Right.
So they prevented access, nothing happened.
But it was written into the deal that we didn't have access to some of those places.
Then the deal is a violation of the safeguard agreements.
Right. I mean, it's just a bad deal.
Yeah.
You know, and people don't realize that. You know, they say, well, it prevented a nuclear weapon. That's far from clear. You know, and for a couple of reasons. We didn't have a baseline. Like, we didn't know how far they'd gotten in the first place. That's a big argument against it.
Right.
The second big argument against it is even if they did abide by it and had every intention of abiding by it, which is possible. I'm not saying that's impossible.
Well, they're not today.
No, well, not today. But even before, even when we were in the deal, it's possible, but it's not probable. And I know the Israelis had intelligence that showed that they were trying to cheat. Before we even pulled out. But even if they weren't, even if they were trying to abide by it and showing patience, which would be in their character because they are a patient, regime. Right. And they're not like the U.S. where we think in 4-year terms. They think
4 years.
Fair, yeah, maybe less, but 2.
That would be an improvement.
Yeah, that's true.
4.
But they think longer term. They're one of the highest virtues in Iran and Persian culture is
patience.
Cleverness and patience. Yeah, and they feel they outsmarted us, and so they could look to 10 to 15 years and say this is great because what happens in 10 to 15 years? You're going to come back to the table and try to tell us not to do something? Well, we already abided by the deal.
The deal shouldn't be, even if it was still in existence, it would have to be thought of as an 8-year deal.
Yeah.
Because on year 8, they would be allowed to install advanced centrifuges.
Okay.
And it would take them from 2015, how many years would it take them to produce new generation of centrifuges? Let's see, 8 years. It takes a generation to produce a new generation of centrifuges, about 8 years. So it was really an 8-year deal in terms of modernization of their capabilities.
Yeah.
And just to see how poor of a deal it was, look all the things they have done.
Yeah. Yeah, but ballistic missile testing.
Well, not just ballistic missile.
capable.
They're installing new generation of centrifuges. They're enriching uranium. The Atomic Energy Organization in Iran is expanding. It has been expanding since 2015 in terms of personnel, technicians and engineers.
Right.
Now, engineers design, technicians build.
Right.
So it's just the level of activity that has gone on, which has allowed them to resume most of their activities with alacrity. And that's so it. The deal's talking points that were used in 2015 were not wrong. They were fraudulent.
Yeah. Okay.
It didn't block the pathways. It wasn't a gold standard of inspection.
You're saying it helped the pathway. It actually encouraged it.
I think it legitimized Iran's nuclear program.
Legitimized, it's a good word.
It enabled it because they could have access to international technologies. Small example. Prior to the deal, Iranian graduate students could not be trained in nuclear physics abroad. They can today. So in a lot of ways, the deal took an illicit nuclear program and branded it legal.
Yeah.
It brought it within the community of nations.
Legitimized it, advanced
Legalized it, legitimized it, advanced it, and enriched it, and enabled it.
Right. And under this false pretense that Iran needs a nuclear program. Right.
Which it doesn't.
Which is...
it doesn't have sufficient domestic indigenous enrichment to operate national civilian
that's
energy.
Never been a feasible explanation or at all for energy purposes or anything else.
Right. So bad deal.
So it's a bad deal. I mean, that's the JCPOA, and the narrative goes that but since the nuclear weapon was taken off the table, which again is highly debatable.
Well, it's not debatable. It was not taken off the table.
It's not taken off the table. In fact, we were put on a path towards that we're safe. I'm just saying what their narrative is. That we were safer, and again, as Susan Rice says, we were getting less rocket attacks in Iraq. What I pointed out was, well, sure, for a period of time, there's less rocket attacks in Iraq, probably because the Shia militias were battling ISIS, not because they just all of a sudden became good people and American lovers. That's just not how it works. But let's not forget, they also boarded a U.S. Navy vessel, instigated multiple civil wars throughout the region, tested, I think, over 20 ballistic missiles, I think 16 of which that we know of are nuclear capable, quadrupled funding to Hezbollah, more than doubled their own defense spending. I mean, I remember being in the military, and we were seeing that the IRGC kept talking about how they increased their funding after the Iran deal. Yeah, because they got a bunch of money. So the incredulous reaction from Democrats when Trump had the audacity to say they used that money to pay for this. I was like, well, that is a plausible explanation, actually.
There are two things one can say. First of all, beginning with the Iranians and the Iraqis and the Americans, everyone's better off that General Soleimani is not around. And they always say, well, he can be easily replaced. Well, I'll give you a Houston metaphor. You take James Harden off the lineup and you go ask the coaching staff, Mike Antonio, hey, can't you find another guy off the bench who can score 40 points?
Yeah.
Sometimes there are guys who are 1 in a million. Soleimani was a 1 in a million guy. In a country of 80 million, can they replace him at some point? Probably, but those guys don't grow on trees.
No.
There are times when elimination of an individual like that does impair capability, at least in short, medium term.
Right.
And his deputy is a fairly lackluster character compared to him.
And he was a micromanager. I mean, he and his relationships and his experience. Of course, it's not easily replaceable. It's foolish to think otherwise.
So that's one aspect of it. The second, in terms of the militias and so on, I suspect what the Iranians are telling their militia is tamper things down for now. Now, it is possible that we'll be distracted and diverted. There's always issues. There's always elections. There's always a crisis. And the problem with our policy potentially is absence of discipline.
Yeah.
That's what...
Yeah. The inability to set those red lines and keep those red lines, which is often...
And sustain them across time.
which is that is a marker of U.S. foreign policy, that it's not consistent enough.
Well, it's becoming more inconsistent,
Yeah.
Because it's becoming a function of our domestic political polarization,
Right.
Where even elimination of Soleimani is not eliciting a bipartisan consensus.
Right, which is, and here's another scenario, which is worth considering and worth hoping for, and something I've said, which is imagine if every member of Congress just said #Free Iran on Twitter. Right. What kind of message would that send to the Iranian people? And this gets to another question, which is the other narrative going on is we've unified the Iranian people against the United States. I mean, is there any modicum of truth to that?
Not that I can think of.
What do you know? Are you from there?
The Iranian regime is a curious one. On January the 3rd, a pro-President Rouhani website that he used to run before he became president published a poll of residents of Tehran, Tehran being the largest city, obviously, where 85% of the people said they were unsatisfied with the government.
Yeah.
Poverty, repression, corruption. We just had protests in Iran after the fuel subsidies were withdrawn because of budgetary things.
So basically they have the same approval rating as Congress.
Lower maybe. But I will say one thing. Upwards of 1,500 people were massacred in the November uprising. If I was a parent of one of those 1,500, I would be appalled that I'm not allowed to have a public memorial for my dead son, but we're going to have a 3-day commemoration for General Soleimani.
Yeah.
I would be appalled by that.
They can't have a funeral?
No, the regime is trying to stop that.
Wow. Oh, because that would, of course, remind everybody that these people were killed by the regime.
In a Shia religious rituals, you bury the dead, you commemorate them 40 days later, so it will be ongoing, sort of a commemoration for a while. And all those commemorations will become politicized and generate their protests. Also, the people who were killed in November were the poor and the working classes.
Yeah.
They were thought to be the regime's last mainstay. The regime doesn't have support among the middle classes, certainly not the upper classes. The working poor, because they were the ones in whose name the revolution was waged in 1979, the oppressed.
Yeah, as they always are.
They're the ones who were tied to the government to some extent by patronage and welfare state, which has been shredded because the regime doesn't have the budgetary. So what we have seen in December 2017 and 18, that period, and in November 2019, is a different kind of a revolt. It's the revolt of the poor.
Really?
So that means the regime has no constituency other than security services.
That's interesting.
The corruption of the regime is particularly galling to many people because it's the corruption of the religious classes.
Yeah.
Those who talk about piety and sacrifice and that sort of honor are deeply corrupt. The class divisions are becoming quite provocative. During the time of poverty, at some point, there were more BMWs in Tehran than in Berlin.
Wow.
Somebody was getting rich. So the regime is in deep domestic trouble. That's one. So I don't see how this attack helps. If you're poor, if you're disenfranchised, if you're disaffected, the death of one of the security service icons isn't going to endear you to them.
Right.
And also, the other thing to remember is that people talk about nationalism, that this has generated nationalism. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has denounced nationalism for 40 years. He thinks nationalism is a Western disease. You and I are all Muslims. He says Persian nationalism, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism is wrong. We are all Muslims. This is why they're so expansionist.
Yeah. Well, I guess that makes sense if it's the Islamic revolution. He never calls it the Iranian revolution.
He's not a nationalist. He's a pan-Islamist.
Yeah.
When the president talked about cultural sites, the first people that tried to blow up cultural sites were the Iranian revolutionary mullahs in 1979. Because they view that as a relic of pre-Islamic Persian past.
Yeah.
As a decadent. So I don't think this redounds to the regime's advantage. As a matter of fact, I think it'll redound to its disadvantage, because now most of the Iranian people don't want to have a war with the United States.
Right.
They understand the costs. So the regime that is so aggressive in the region is not necessarily consistent with their foreign policy orientation to the extent that that can be deciphered.
What kind of access to information do the Iranian people have at this point?
I think we can always do better on that front. The information today is fairly porous because of penetration of social media.
Okay. So can they see what I'm saying on social media? Is that possible at all?
If you can get it up and get it some translation and put it on BBC, yeah, or elsewhere.
Well, let's say they speak English. Like,
yeah.
Are they seeing any? Do they have what kind of access? If you're in Tehran right now, what can you go on Facebook and see anybody's profile? How does that?
Yeah, they have. At least in urban centers, is deep penetration by social media.
Okay.
So the regime cannot insulate the country from information. Although they did one thing in the November protests, which surprised me. They shut down the internet for the whole country.
Yeah.
No other country has ever done that. I don't know how much it costs them.
Shows how scared they are.
Well, I don't how much it costs them in terms of finances, but it's also demonstrated how they have thought about control in times of crisis. But in ordinary times, it's an unusual regime because there's a lot of flaws of the regime are pointed out in its own discourse.
Yeah.
So also we don't have to tell the Iranian regime to hate their government. They already do.
Yeah. What should we tell them? I mean, if I could put out the perfect message and I knew they would see it on social media and I could get the whole Congress behind it, I mean, what would that message be?
I think we need to talk more about issues of human rights, about democracy, about a regime that's accountable to its public. I think too often we stay away from those themes because we are quote unquote afraid of the phrase regime change.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
bad taste in our mouths.
I don't think we should not talk about human rights, an issue of democracy, an issue of voter fraud, an issue of transparently fraudulent government and its processes. I don't think we should stop talking about that because they do.
Yeah.
They understand the corruption. They understand that they don't live in a representative government. They understand that those are the things they want.
Yeah.
And I think too often we stay away from those topics because of in our mind, the obscenity of the phrase regime change.
Yeah. And would you say that there's a benefit to that? I mean, as far as moral support to people? Is there a real tangible benefit to doing that?
I don't think we can ever go wrong standing up for democratic values in places where those democratic values are wanted and desired.
So when they see that we're divided on this decision to kill somebody like Soleimani after he did what he did and after we had the intelligence we had,
that's amplified in their press.
The fact that we're divided on that. Okay, so talk about that for a second.
Well, the commentary coming from the United States. This is not to suggest in any way that Americans cannot be critical of their government.
Right.
I mean, if they want to criticize, that.
Well, let's assume good intentions for now.
If Susan Rice wants to criticize the policy of President Trump, I think she's perfectly entitled to do so.
Sure. Yeah. Let's assume good intentions on the other side, but how does the Iranian government perceive that?
They tend to amplify and republish commentary in American press by luminaries, former officials, whatever, suggesting that Americans are left safe, the empowerment of Iran, and so on.
Right.
Those do work their way back.
It plays into their propaganda machine.
It plays into their propaganda machine. But again, it's just what it is. I mean, this is a price we pay for having a democratic system with pluralism and free speech. So
it is. But it's a fact too. I mean, it's important to note the facts.
Yeah.
And I don't think
it plays into regime's narrative of empowerment and capability and instigating fears in a superpower.
Yeah.
But that's something we have to live with.
What would you tell people that they often misunderstand about Persian culture or the Iranian government? And what's one of the number one misconceptions?
There's an extraordinary difference between the way the Iranian government thinks about its future and the way the Iranian people think about their future. Mm-hmm. The Iranian government wants to meddle throughout the Middle East. Most Persians don't want their resources spent on Arab civil wars. Most Persians are indifferent to the plight of the Palestinians and don't understand the confrontation with Israel. Most Iranians actually want to have better relationship with the United States and the West, and they don't understand the confrontation between the two sides for 40 years, which they have been victimized by.
Yeah.
Most Iranians don't want to be governed by a religious theocracy, but by a representative government. Most Iranians are intellectually mature enough to actually handle a pluralism and democracy and all the things that go with it.
Yeah.
Most Iranians are educated enough, this is a country of 80-90% illiteracy, to manage an economy as opposed to this corrupt, bankrupt system that they have.
Yeah.
The gap between state...
You said literacy, not illiteracy.
Literacy, yes.
Yeah.
The gap between state and society is something that we often miss. And that gap is unbridgeable. Mm-hmm. Whether General Soleimani or not, the Iranian people will like to be rid of the regime.
Is there any chance of that happening?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Yeah.
I do think that we'll get to the post-Islamic Republic period. Mm-hmm. I don't think the Islamic Republic is a 1,000-year Reich. I think we'll get to the post-Islamic Republic period simply because the business model just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And the regime no longer has any kind of a reliable constituency. And there's one thing that is now becoming crystal clear to the Iranian public. Two things. One, the regime is incapable of reforming itself.
Yeah.
Number two, and this happened around 78, 77 with the previous Iranian regime, the monarchy. At some point, when the Iranian economy began to decline in the 1970s, all countries experienced recession. But the economic narrative had a psychological tinge to it in the 1970s. It wasn't that we're having a recession. Is that things are never going to get better, and I didn't get mine. And I know who did. You have the same psychological dimension to Iran's current economic crisis, that the good times are over, they're never coming back, and I didn't get mine, only those people did.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful and corrosive message.
It's divisive.
Absolutely. So I think we'll get to the post-Islamic Republic period.
So how does that happen? I mean, is it simply the Iranian people rising up? Are there outside? I mean, I know there's outside groups. Right. You know, the Shahs.
Right. I don't know if you can ever predict with precision how a regime like this collapses. Nobody have predicted how the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right.
Nobody have predicted how other regimes collapsed. Nobody have predicted the way Shah's regime collapsed, the monarchy in 1979. What we can say with some measure of certainty that all the conditions for the collapse of the regime exist.
Yeah.
And regimes like that decay for a long time before they finally collapse. And we're seeing the decay, the hollowing out, the sort of exit of the elite, the brain drain. Yeah. Most people don't understand how Iran is affected by brain drain.
Right.
Because one of the clever things that the regime has done is, unlike the old Soviet Union, if you got a degree in in computer science and you can go to Australia, go ahead. Mm-hmm. That removes an explosive political problem, but it also creates a whole set of other economic and problems as well. So one of the ways they have managed their political situation is by allowing people to leave.
Yeah.
Just Iranian American communities, Iranian American communities here. There's an Iranian community in Japan.
Right.
India, Australia, Canada, all over Europe.
Yeah.
It's not healthy for the future of a state, a future of a government, for the best and the brightest to leave.
Well, let me ask you about the structure of the government real quick. I mean, so there's a parliament, there's a president, there's a supreme leader, there's the IRGC. How does that work? I mean, who really is in control?
Gridlock.
Yeah.
It just can't pass legislation.
Yeah.
The parliament is a venerable place because of a history of parliament going back to early 20th century. And so it's part of a constitutional revolution and so on. The president does command considerable authority because he oversees the bureaucracy and has some leeway on foreign policy, as you saw with the Iran nuclear negotiations. The military, there's a Supreme National Security Council that features all the leadership that is chaired by the president, the Speaker of the Parliament. So there is this sort of a communal system that comes together in times of crisis, or tries to. There's a lot of internal divisions today in the system.
Yeah.
They just can't agree on things. particularly the question that divides the elite today, the political elite, the Islamic Republic elite, is a question of what ails our economy.
Yeah.
What is the cause of our economic decline? That's actually an issue that's being debated. And the supreme leader's idea is what he calls economic resistance, namely that we develop internal markets, we develop local markets, and not rely on the West. And on the other hand, President Rouhani's idea was to get commerce from Europe and so on. So principal question that divides the elite now is what ails our economy. And that, by definition, is a political issue.
Yeah.
It's a foreign relations issue. So, and some people are saying some intelligent things, namely that not all our problems economically have to do with sanctions. Mm-hmm. A lot of mismanagement. They do have an anti-corruption campaign going.
Really?
But given the fact that everybody's corrupt, any anti-corruption campaign is going to be selective.
Yeah.
And it's going to be selective based upon political prejudice. So they do recognize the problems, but the problem that they have is they can't solve them. It's not that they don't understand their problems, but they just can't reform themselves.
Does the supreme leader, though, have final say over effectively every policy? So there's a lot that's debated underneath that, but for the most part, he can reverse just about anything. There's no...
He's got power to reverse elections, nullify them if he chooses. He's a commander of the armed forces. He has 2 representatives at the Supreme National Security Council.
Right.
He is the final say. I mean, the word supreme does have... Yeah,
that does mean something.
It does mean something.
A lot of people say Soleimani was the heir to that title. Is that any truth to that?
No, I don't think so. Soleimani was a commander of a specific segment of the Revolutionary Guards that was responsible for Iran's activity beyond its borders. I don't think he was... There is a succession crisis looming. Mm-hmm. Ali Khamenei is 80 years old. They're trying to groom somebody to be his successor. It's entirely, at this particular point, the regime does not have sufficient internal consensus to manage a succession crisis.
Oh, interesting.
At this point,
I wonder if that's the tipping point.
That's one of the tipping points, because whatever his flaws, Ali Khamenei is the glue that holds the system together.
Yeah.
And they are actually trying to groom a successor to him, who's the head of the head of the judiciary now, Ibrahim Raisi.
Yeah.
He's got good credentials for the job. He's a mass murderer.
Yeah.
He sanctions all kinds of...
That's probably a checkbox you have to check.
For a regime that's potentially hitting turbulence, having some guy who's willing to pull the trigger or provide religious sanctions for killing. People always talk about the Revolutionary Guards versus the religious leadership, who's in charge. They used to say about Prussia, every country has an army. In Prussia, the army has a country. That's not the case here. I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship. They need each other.
Yeah. Going back to the will of the people real quick, because something came to mind, which was Soleimani's funeral. Right. Well attended. Right. We have some weird descriptions of that funeral from our country, in putting it in glowing terms. But so given how unpopular the regime is, how do you get that many people to turn out for a funeral? Is that just everybody? Is that the 15% that actually supports them?
The Islamic Republic for 40 years has been very good at staging demonstrations.
Okay. How do they do that?
They bus you in, you get free meal, all this people in work offices and so on have a day off, and you have to come in, you get privileges. They've been very good for 40 years at staging demonstrations.
Interesting.
This is one of the expertise that they have.
Yeah.
As revolutionaries who came to power through demonstrations, they understand the street power.
Yeah.
So they can mobilize demonstrations for something like that,
right.
For funerals. Some of it may be genuine expressions of momentary expression of concern about what has happened. But I do think that is a well-practiced craft of the regime to stage street demonstrations.
Yeah.
It does have some mobilization power in that sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if it's interesting the way you put it, they have experience as revolutionaries. And if you think about radical activists in any country, there's certain tactics that you use. Right. And we see it all the time.
Yeah. Right.
So that's interesting. So this is the week. This is the second week of January. How do you see this playing out for the next month or two?
Well, they have to figure out what happened. I mean, we underestimate how unsettled they must be at this stage. Mm-hmm. After 40 years of a certain type of foreign policy practice, they have a problem now.
Yeah.
They have never been able to understand President Trump.
Yeah.
They're unsettled by his unpredictability. They don't know how to deal with offer of negotiations, terrorism, punishment for terrorism. They haven't figured this out. Internally, there's no consensus for how to talk to the United States.
Yeah.
I think President Rouhani wanted to, but I think he's probably a poor agent. Mm-hmm. My guess is at this particular point, a number of things happen. First of all, there's going to be a lot of intermediaries going to Tehran and Washington, trying to generate some talk. Whenever there's a talk of war, it never leads to war, it leads to diplomacy.
Yeah.
So there'd be a lot of intermediaries coming and going between Tehran and Washington saying, whether it's President Macron again of France, whether it's Prime Minister Abe, whether it's the Iraqis who have tried to mediate between the United States and Iran and have an interest in doing so today. Mm-hmm. So I suspect we see a lot of back-channel chatter, but I think my guess is what the Iranian government will try to do is wait to see what happens with our elections.
Yeah.
If the president is reelected, they have to recalibrate again and potentially approach him with a diplomatic opening.
Right.
If somebody else is elected, then there's not much they need to do because the traffic will go the other way.
It's going to, the appeasement strategy will come back in full force.
Well, the traffic is going to go the other way. They don't have to reach out. They'll be reached out to.
They will. Again, for the strange reasons, the curious reasons that we talked about. I guess in a sense you already answered this, but what should we do? I mean, ideally, what does our strategy going forward look like? I mean, how is there a path to a nuclear deal or a deal in general that's actually good?
Well, what I would say about the president's policy. At every step of the way, he has defied conventional wisdom and succeeded. He said that, his critic says that if he leaves the deal, United States will be isolated. Not true. Mm-hmm. If United States leaves the deal, it will not be able to multilateralize its economic sanctions. Not true.
Right.
If it sanctions or takes active measures against Iranian military leadership, will be in a war. Mm-hmm. Not true.
Not true.
So his critics have
been... If you kill the head of the IRGC, we're still not in a war.
Not in a war. Yeah. So at every step of the way, our maximum pressure strategy has succeeded.
Right.
You cannot lower the Iranian oil exports without disrupting the global economy. Not true. We can go to the checklist of talking points that have been negated. What you would do now, I would sustain the strategy of pressure, and I would actually try to get the Europeans to reimpose the UN Security Council sanctions. Those sanctions were in place, and if Iran violated the deal, which they are today, they have been for a long time. You heard the phrase in 2015 about snapback.
Yeah.
Now it's time for the snapback to come in.
Right.
So the president referenced that Europeans should essentially snap back the UN sanctions. Whether Europeans will do so or not, I'm not sure, but the United States itself has legal authority to do that.
Right.
That's one. I think the strategy of pressure, I would continually apply it because two things will happen. Either Iranians will return to the table in a more humbled way or the regime will collapse. My guess at the end of the day is the Islamic Republic can break, but it's unlikely to bend. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if there's a deal out there along the parameters that are durable to deal with the problem.
Right, the parameters that we would need to call it a good deal.
Yeah. The Secretary Pompeo's 12 points.
Right.
From May 2018.
Right.
Where he established the parameters of a good deal. I don't think we should walk those parameters back.
Yeah.
Because they're sensible.
Last question is Iran's neighbor, Iraq, and the growing Iranian influence there. What do we do about the Shia leaders in Iraq that are fully in the pocket and fully in the interest of Iran instead of the Iraqis?
Other people can speak about this more intelligently than I can. I never believed that Iraqis want to be dominated by the Iranians. Mm-hmm. And you saw the demonstrations that are taking place. Yep. Those demonstrations were very important because it was Shiis revolting against a Shi'i government sponsored by a Shi'i nation across the street, across the boundaries. I think there's a great deal of estrangement between Iranian clerical community and the Iraqi clerical community. Because what the Iranian clerical community wants to do is colonize the Iraqi clerical community and make it subordinate.
Right.
So there's a lot of inner Shi'i religious tension. The fact that Iranians are using Iraqi territory as a segue to their grand imperial project.
Yeah.
The fact that they're using Iraqi territory to smuggle and get around sanctions. The fact that Iraqi corruption is attributed to them. The fact that they're corrupting the Iraqi politics. This has generated considerable degree of resentment against Iran by the Iraqis themselves. You would think we could take advantage of that.
Yeah, you would think, and I assume you believe that we should stick it out and not leave Iraq.
I don't believe we're about to leave.
I don't think so either. Although they did they requested that we send diplomats over to begin the withdrawal, but we'll see how that actually turns out. How much of that do you think is a show of?
Well, to be fair, Iraqis are in a very difficult position.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to be the playground or the venue of U.S.-Iran confrontation.
Right.
And I can see that point.
Yeah.
They have tried to maintain a relationship with Iran and maintain a relationship with the United States and maybe even mediate between the two. Mm-hmm. They're in a position where they're subject to extraordinary degree of pressure from the Iranians and penetration, and they're not entirely certain about American intentions.
Yeah, it's one of those things. If you know that America's attention span is a little bit short, then it's harder to put faith in that relationship. And the Kurds, unfortunately, recently found that out. Yeah. And that's a problem we have with the inconsistency that you mentioned. So we'll see how that turns out. Maybe by the time people hear this podcast, there'll be a few more answers to that question. But until then, maybe we'll have you back on.
Sure, happy to do
for that. So, hey, Dr. Ray Takeyh, thank you so much for being on this show and illuminating what is a pretty complex subject.
Thanks for having me.